slight issue that it's actually saved the previous video we made.
It's alright, it'll overwrite it.
Will it?
No, well, we can delete that tomorrow.
Okay, we can delete it now because people are going to go to that one now, aren't they? Because it's going to be
If one says live, we'll delete it, but yeah, you just
let's just go and delete that.
Perhaps I'll put these at the back, actually.
How do we...
So, go to Video Manager, maybe. Yeah, there it is, like 2 minutes now.
Fantastic video. But let's delete it. Okay, good.
This video has been removed by the user.
Okay, now that looks like it's streaming.
Yeah, we are live. So just press one to get it.
Right.
Right, so you remember I would disconnect the stream, yeah? Outputs then just turn on.
Remind me.
So, oh yeah. Right, so remember I would disconnect the stream, just this. And then
You
just
should
shut
me
down
out
the
this bit.
video.
Okay, cool.
And you can watch back the stream. It'll tell you if you run out.
Yeah.
Right, guys, have a great evening. I need to get off.
Thanks, mate. Enjoy dodgeball.
It's really nice to meet you.
You too. Bye.
I'll watch this back when I get off.
Nice one. See you later.
What do you do, Rob, when you're not?
So I'm a doctor, but I'm a public health registrar. It's my day job, which is nice. Gives me time to
Yeah.
do this kind of thing.
So it will be possible to find it online afterwards, won't it?
It can be, and we can delete it if you'd prefer.
No. It's fine.
Just trying to work out how to actually access it.
Or maybe I should tell you afterwards if I want you to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how it goes. Hey, Amanda. How are you doing? Good. How are you? Some booze there, fancy.
You alright?
Yeah, it is. Why I can't find it when Mike is.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello. Sorry to
Here we
interrupt.
go.
We're a bit early. Is this the meeting that's supposed to start at 6:30 for the refugees?
You're in the right place.
Right,
Come
perfect.
get settled in.
Oh, we can stay, can we?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to set up the streaming for it. Why is this restricted?
Happy to say in fact, the man
جا باشه و گفتم 3 شب
Okay, good.
حتی دیگه 3 شب جا باشه بعد گفتم که با هم بیای منم سعی میکنم با تو بیام تجربه کنم ساعت 5 اینجا باشیم بعد خواستم گفت الان فعلا ما 3 تا وکیل هستی خیلی خوشحالیم که تو رو کمک کنیم و هفته بعد آشنا بشیم مثل که این آدم خیلی خوبی هست بعد گفتم یه اطلاعات از تو خواستم
It's like a few seconds delay.
Sorry.
It's a few seconds delay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So kind of a weirdly long. Just trying to make sure
همون که
everyone's going to be able to
15
get to it.
20 صفحه داشته باشه
Very complicated.
خیلی بلند
Okay, some of these things restricted on my account.
آره همینه
There we go. Okay.
آره همینه خب مسابقه فقط 2 تا هستن یکی موقع که آمدی دومم که تصمیم بگیرم اولشون میتونی حد بندازی که من اسمشون بنویسم
No, I'm just talking.
Okay, we've got at least one person streaming.
It's right on the central lines, I think.
نمیدونم میخوام شروع
Oh, we've got four streaming.
اگه میتونستیم این مدارک بفرستیم که یواش یواش
Glad I've got my stupid username from like my childhood YouTube account.
I
Excellent.
can't see it on
Oh well. Maybe I can change it. dear.
پس من الان ایمیلشون رو میدم
I can probably
That
do
was the thing,
I
wasn't
can
it?
do that another
Silly
time.
username.
Yeah.
Put your year of birth in your email address.
It's not that silly. It's not like offensive or anything. At least. Okay.
چون که اسم تو بهشون دادم باشه همشون نه آره تقریبا یادم من از این مصاحبه مدارک تقریبا 20 صفحه باشه بعد آره الان پس ایمیلشون بهت میفرستم خودت میفرستی الان میفرستی آها داره برمیگردی تو مثلا 1 ساعت دیگه
No, she's in Istanbul. Yeah, it's a bit out of the way, but she's going to be. I believe she's going to be on YouTube. Can we see who's connected? Ah, good. Lindsay Davis says, "Good evening, London."
Oh, good evening.
چیز دیگه نخواستم دیگه هفته بعد که با من میریم اونجا همه اطلاعات رو بیارم خب هنوز خب فردا برو به نوبت اونجا که بهدادم ببین اون وکیل چی میگه ولی خب ببین ولی اون یکی هم انجام بدیم خیلی خوبشه فکر میکنم آدم خوبی هست
Cool. I'm Rob.
So you weren't cleared?
Yeah, exactly. So we need the take action group.
آره
I
کارشون
couldn't make clear last time.
We can come to the last.
I think I missed the last one. The one I was at last was somebody taking us through the asylum process, and I kind of learned a lot from that, and also how pregnant women's needs aren't truly met. I mean, you could argue that everybody's needs are not met, but it did seem that quite truly pregnant women's were not quite met as well as we could do considering we're in this country.
Yeah.
So I kind of learned that, and also learned where people kind of place. It was more north, wasn't it? I remember. Yorkshire sort of area. I can't remember specifics because I've also wondered in my work why I'm not coming across more people. But if they're placed up there, that would be why I'm not really meeting. Yeah.
Whereabouts is it you work?
I work for the NHS, so I work as a nurse and midwife.
Whereabouts?
Imperial,
Cool.
and I work across sites, so I work at 3 main hospitals.
There isn't a shortage. I work in East London and we have huge
In a sense, amazing.
I'm not saying I don't get any asylum seekers, but I don't think I've got any of the type that we were talking about last time I was here. I mean, yes, lots of people are coming here and want to be here, but the type that we were talking about last time are the really needy ones that kind of have to come in and have to go through the system. There's plenty arriving that kind of bob off the back of friends and relatives and other people they know, which is maybe the ones that we've come across from time to time down here. But certainly not the very vulnerable ones that they were talking about up north. Yeah. Well, that's the impression I've got anyway.
Sure. Interesting. So you work in one of the hospitals in East London?
not a hospital, but in mental health services.
Okay, well, yeah. We know there's huge kind of need for that.
Yeah, and there really is a shortage of vulnerable and destitute.
Hopefully today's session's going to be very interesting as well.
Yeah. Be interesting to have your thoughts on from a mental health perspective. We'll touch on that.
You're a solicitor.
No, I'm a doctor. Yeah. Yeah.
How many?
Could you help myself to water?
You absolutely can. Have yourself to water, beer, wine, snacks.
Water's a good start.
It's not the healthiest spread, but
Can I pour anybody else some or pass anyone something?
I'm fine at the moment, thank you.
glass of water, that's right. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think I will too. So you picked up some of our poetry.
Oh, sorry.
You picked up some of our poetry.
Do you know what? I
Yeah.
thought this would be so nice to take to work and put it up on the thin board. Probably more. People might be more interested in this than looking at some of the other sort of torture pictures
Yeah.
or other pictures.
Yeah.
They probably,
Yeah.
although that is a different picture, it's very much advertising freedom from torture. But I mean, people are seeing lots of things that
Yeah.
are looking like that.
Yeah.
Wouldn't stand out
Yeah.
where this.
I think because it's such a human thing, it's such a human form of expression that it's probably quite powerful actually, as opposed to the facts that we're constantly bombarded with. So
Yeah, that's right. However, the last meeting was that it was lots of facts and it was incredibly interesting.
it was very good. I was there for that as well.
Incredibly. I just thought it was totally amazing. I still have to say, I have to confess, you did send the minutes out for the last meeting, which is the one I missed.
Oh, for the entitlement to health.
Yeah. So I need to catch up on that really.
Yeah, well for that, all the resources are online. So the Doctors of the World training session. If that's the one you're talking about.
Yeah, it might be.
And
I think there's one other thing I think
I think we probably had either a strategy meeting or we've had a few just general meetings as well.
Oh, maybe
Just with updates on kind of what we've been up to and where we are with the various projects and stuff like that. So I'm sure we'll send something up soon as well. Lovely.
Yeah. No, you young man. Lisbon.
Young man, he's a young man. Could that no longer?
Alright. Think.
just really at that It is a very interesting topic.
It's a little bit hard work, but we're trying to be positive and go, actually, everything in the garden is lovely. Lovely. It's too wet tonight. Can't play on here, but it's too wet. No, it's
I'm going to
Give it a few more minutes.
yeah, it's just
Is
brilliant.
that cool?
You can use this chair if you really wanted to.
Oh yes,
Spreading
just
out.
move the
Oh, no, please.
Okay, Janet's coming in there as well, so I'll skip the chair.
Done it. Put it in. I've been asked recently.
Oh, sorry, I just spread out everywhere, don't I?
And be moderating the online team.
Keeping them in line.
It's just such misbehaving here.
Are you going to tell us any live comments?
That's why I'm just kind of writing a little message to say that I'll kind of
That would be lovely.
relay their messages as needed.
Is Mike coming back?
Mike's not coming back now.
What is French?
Really?
Do you know where I can find it?
He's gone. He's off playing. He's gone. Yeah, he's gone to play dodgeball. So
I can give it a
Yeah?
that's probably going to be your best bet.
Thanks.
I would love to do the conditioners now. I don't know.
That's it? That's alright. It's not reached. But we were really accepted.
We could probably do some introductions.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Should we get started? So 1 second. Let me just switch over on here.
Probably need to stand up here so that I can see this. Don't mean to turn my back to you, but I'm just
So I'm getting messages from people who are streaming. Brilliant. Okay. I'm not sure the chat's working very well. Cool. Thanks everyone for coming along today to the second Take Action Group information evening. We're really pleased to have Rachel here to speak to us today. So I'll let you kind of properly introduce yourself. But Rachel's a doctor working with Freedom from Torture, and is going to be talking to us a bit about the work that they do and in documenting kind of medical and psychological evidence and how that kind of works in the context of the UK asylum process. At least that's how I understand it anyway. So thanks a lot for coming along, and I'll hand over to Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for coming. So as Rob said, I'm Rachel Bingham. I'm a medical doctor in the Medical Legal Reports Department with Freedom from Torture. And I also do some medical legal reports for a similar organisation called Medical Justice. I expect you've heard of them. The difference really is that Medical Justice see people in immigration removal centres, and Freedom from Torture sees survivors of specifically of torture in our clinics in London and elsewhere in the UK. I've been with MSF in 2016 in the project in Cairo for survivors of violence, which was fascinating for me actually when I think about the migration route, because of course we see some people in London who've had some time in Egypt on their way across, perhaps then across Europe. So I wonder if there's not too many people to just quickly sort of go around and say, I'd be interested just to know who you are and what your sort of background or connection to this evening is, if that's all right. Shall we? Is that okay?
Doesn't matter.
Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
No, I'm Fran. I've worked on and off for MSF for quite some years. I also work as a consultant on staff care, as well as I used to work more operationally. But I'm currently employed full-time with the NHS for SLAM, South London and Maudsley, Land of IPTT, which is a strong therapist down there. And I've also worked previously in London with charities. We used to see a lot of undocumented migrants. So, yes. So I'm really pleased to be here tonight because sometimes the information in the statutory services is not always quite getting through. Yeah.
Sorry, Rachel, can I ask you to just sit in the next seat along? Is that okay?
Yes.
We're getting complaints from the online team. Cheers.
I'm Janet. I'm a nurse. I joined MSF in 2000. Presently, I'm a voluntary coordinator, which means we give confidential support or offer to all our field staff coming back. But I also work with street work, people that were homeless, but many homeless people, asylum seekers. So I really need information from you tonight for that work. And that's St Martin's in the Fields in London. So what you find lost souls hidden in alleyways, hidden homeless. And, it's quite upsetting when you meet people who could just come to Croydon and ask for asylum and would get it. They don't know, they get here and they're so relieved.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I was with MSF on my first mission. I was in Greece last year, so I've seen a lot of the migration path coming through. And I'm not a medic, I was a Farsi interpreter, so I was working with a lot of Iranian and Afghani refugees. And I'm now doing a lot of voluntary work in London as well, so I'm just interested in finding out as much information as possible.
I'm Ray, and I work as a receptionist at MSF. I'm very inspired and like where we are today.
I'm Sarah. I just retired from DRC as the first definition there. I used to work for Freedom for Culture a couple of years ago as a health assessment doctor for a little while, and then I worked in Greenstone refugee camps for a bit, and currently working with a group to put together a clinical handbook treatment of refugees in different settings.
I'm Amanda. My first mission with MSF was in 1998, South Sudan. Did a number of missions with them. I'm now an active member of the association, being the IGA rep for the association, voted on. And part of the Take Action group, not a medic. It's an interest.
I'm Mike, I'm a biomedical scientist. I joined MSF 2001. I think I've done about 19 or 20 missions of varying degrees of length. Particularly interested in Myanmar, where I spent 4.5 years in all parts of Myanmar. Gave up a couple of years ago. Last mission was Ethiopia. I'm getting on a bit and I found it a bit difficult, so I decided to retire. But I do go back to Myanmar twice a year on holiday to see MSF.
I'm Matt. I'm a logistician, 2 missions in Syria and Iraq. I'm a member of the Canadian Association, but I've moved to the UK, so I'm looking to be involved with the UK Association.
Hi, my name's Tracy. I work for the NHS as a nurse and midwife. I'm just really here to see what I can learn and take back to work, so that I can use. Because again, like somebody's already said, some of this information that can be helpful for us to help people at work is not so easily available.
My name's Viv, I'm a nurse, worked with MSF in Sudan and Uganda, and I work for the NHS in refugee health in London at the moment, so we do screening and health screening and also undocumented migrants. Yeah. So this is my bread and butter.
I'm Alison. I worked with MSF for a few years from 2000. I'm a psychologist and I work at the NHS in East London, specialising in trauma. and it had a lot of different freedom from torture.
Oh, hi, my name is Mohammed. I trained as a psychiatrist a few years ago, and then I trained in philosophy, and I do research in philosophy and psychiatry, mental health, activism, and I'm Rachel's husband.
I'm Rebecca. I worked for MSF several years ago now. I was interested in just finding out a bit more about freedom from torture. Partly because I saw an advert for doctors, and but I missed the date. So I saw this going on, so I thought I'd come to find out more. But I work in the NHS.
Thank you. Great, interesting group. Thank you very much for coming. I'll tell you a bit about freedom from torture, I think, to start with. I'm sorry for the video if I'm moving too much, but as you might know, freedom from torture developed out of the medical group of Amnesty International in the 80s. So there were a group of doctors who were documenting evidence of torture for Amnesty's international campaigns. And then they kind of broke off to start an organisation that would also provide for rehabilitation for survivors in the UK. Around the same time, the UN Convention Against Torture had been adopted in the 80s, and that also provides not just for prohibition of torture, but also for redress and rehabilitation for survivors. So that was the context. We rebranded in about 2000 as Freedom from Torture, having been initially Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture. And then about 10 years later, the government's dispersal scheme saw, we've touched earlier on refugees all over the country, but saw refugees moved around the north of England, and we've opened offices in Newcastle, Manchester and Glasgow in response to that, and now Birmingham. And we're now one of the world's largest torture treatment organisations. So where do our clients come from? It's just a map of the world, really, but it happens to be the countries that have ratified the UN Convention Against Torture. So we've got in dark blue countries who've agreed to be bound by the convention, and then the pale blue countries have just given a preliminary endorsement, and just a few in orange that haven't taken any action on the UN Convention Against Torture. The reason I'm showing this map is actually to show of the countries in which torture takes place, which I'll go on to say is many, they've all agreed not to do torture. And so what we can work out from that is that torture takes place in secret and against the country's own declaration not to do torture. And so none of these governments report their own torture internally or externally, of course, and people that try to often find themselves in risk of persecution or indeed of torture themselves. And in fact, that may be the backstory behind how some of our clients have found themselves in difficulties. But it also means I can't tell you the proper epidemiology of torture, which I'd like to do. But we do know, unfortunately, that it's flourishing. And Amnesty have reported torture in over 3/4 of the world's countries from every region of the world. And all I can say is that's bound to be an underestimate because, of course, that's just the reported cases. These are our referrals, so they're lowish numbers because actually we've had referrals from over 75 countries, but these are our top 10 referrals from 2016. And again, of course, this is a tip of the iceberg situation because, of course, these individuals have made it to the UK, they've disclosed their torture, they've got a legal or a medical representative who's referred them for medical evidence at Freedom from Torture, but there is perhaps a pattern as our top referring countries tend to stay the same. I'm going to just say a little bit about the kinds of problems that these people are coming to us with, what kinds of things they've been through and who they are, and a bit about what is torture, just to sort of set the scene to move on to what happens next in the immigration system. I hope that's all right. So who are we seeing? So basically professional groups, I'm sure we would relate to all of these groups, teachers, lawyers, doctors, many political activists, so really anybody who may have come into contact with the authorities. And our client group includes many extraordinarily courageous people, but also many people who've been living very much normal lives like all of us up to the point of their arrest. And of course we also see husbands, wives, children of all of these people because of course they're also at risk of ill treatment themselves. And why is this happening? Well, of course, as I said, maybe a punishment or a threat by the authorities to intimidate people. Gaining information, of course, is the typical sort of movie theatre case of trying to torture somebody to find out other information. There's, as I'm sure you know now, a body of evidence showing that this doesn't work. And indeed what our clients tell us is that under such conditions they were prepared to say anything to make it stop. And so, of course, we know torture is ineffective, but this still is often the justification. And of course, many people who've just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. So people who may have been caught up in a demonstration or connected to somebody who turned out to be of political significance. And we even see cases of mistaken identity. What is torture? I'll put here the United Nations definition. So the UN have defined torture as any act in which severe pain and suffering is inflicted, which can be psychological or physical, intentionally inflicted and for a specific purpose, and also by an agent of the state, which the UN can include rebel factions. So this sort of official UN definition hinges on acts done in official or political capacity, and so it includes, by definition, other forms of brutality, so domestic violence or other forms of gender-based violence, human trafficking, FGM. These are not torture according to this definition. This is really important politically at the moment because, as you might know, our government currently are reviewing the definition of torture, which is to be used as part of their adults at risk policy for immigration detention. So previously, an adult at risk has been a survivor of severe violence. If we only apply this strict definition of torture, then a survivor of trafficking might not be counted as an adult at risk. They might then become somebody who could be detained in immigration detention. Is that something that you're sort of familiar with as a debate that's happening at the moment? So it's something to look out for, and actually I've put some information on the back table there. The people on video are welcome to email me if I can be of help for this, but there's a page like this which is our briefing for MPs actually, which has been recently passed around our local MPs, and that gives some of the facts as the background to this debate, and an action which we would like really, which is to call on the Home Secretary to pause this process while consulting really expert evidence on the effects of immigration detention, who should be considered a survivor of severe violence and therefore an adult at risk. So there's more information there, and I'm happy to discuss further if people are interested. I think that's an interesting campaign that we could all be involved in at the moment. So thinking about what our clients who are survivors really of the official definition of torture, or the UN definition of torture, I should say, what sorts of things have people been through? So of course, physical torture, I apologise for saying some things that may be quite grim now, but it includes, of course, various forms of violence, so beating, suspension, being tied in painful positions for prolonged periods, submersion underwater, electric shocks, burns. Some of those forms of torture are designed to leave very few marks or scars. You may have heard of waterboarding, which of course doesn't leave any physical evidence, but is of course described as terrifying because it creates a sensation of drowning. But other forms leave very clear physical scars. So, for example, in some countries people are burnt or branded, which we think may even be deliberate to make them recognisable to the authorities later. And in that situation, of course, you would have diagnostic medical evidence of what's happened. So it's of interest to us at doing our medical evidence. All torture, of course, is psychological, but some forms of torture are purely psychological. So we hear about mock executions, people being deliberately terrorised into thinking someone will be killed. And we would include severe forms of deprivation as torture, so particularly being deprived of light or water, solitary confinement, deprived of contact. So if these forms of deprivation are severe enough, then of course they constitute torture. And sexual torture is reported very widely. So I think in over 50% of our client groups from the range of countries I listed earlier, and in both men and women. So, and increasingly reported. You might have seen in the media a couple of months ago, a group of 50 Sri Lankan Tamil men came out disclosing sexual torture by the authorities in Sri Lanka, which was really an unprecedented mass disclosure, but was fully supported by the evidence that we've been collecting for some years at Freedom from Torture. So as doctors, what's our role in this? So as a medical legal report doctor at Freedom from Torture, my job is to provide medical evidence of torture. So I'm going to examine my clients' bodies and mental state and document any psychological or physical consequences of the history. And then I will write a report giving my medical opinion of what the probable causes of those scars and lesions were, including any other ways that they might have been caused, to enable the immigration decision maker to decide whether or not they accept this as evidence of the history of torture. So of course the primary use of that is to help the individual with his or her asylum claim, and they would take that report to their legal representative who will submit it as evidence for their claim. But we also can use the report for research, so we're continually developing our body of knowledge about what's happening and where. We can use that to actually hold torturing states accountable through advocacy and campaigning. If you are interested to look on our website, we have country reports based on our data from Sri Lanka, from Iran, recently from DRC. So we're actually able to collect our information, which is medical evidence of what's happening around the world. And we can also discuss, which is really what I want to move on to now, what happens in the UK and how the UK government handles that kind of evidence when it's presented. So there's some copies of this here as well, and it's also available to download online. This is a report published just over a year ago about the Home Office handling of our medical evidence. One of our clients who's featured in this report is called Ali. Ali's a young man from Iran who was caught up in a demonstration, an anti-government demonstration in Iran, and he was arrested. And he was then detained for a month for his participation in this illegal demonstration. And so he was interrogated about his political activities, and as part of the interrogation he was beaten and whipped, so he'd been tortured. And then his family managed to get him released and actually to smuggle him out of the country on the day of his release. Obviously very frightened for his safety, and they arranged for him to come to the UK, and he claimed asylum soon after. That he's one of 50 cases who are our clients who've given us permission to report their cases in this report. Now, to put Ali's legal situation in context, I'm going to just remind myself and us of the asylum process that he now has to go through now that he's here in the UK. I know my colleague reviewed some of this in the previous event here, and so it's just a quick recap. Ali actually claimed asylum quite soon after arrival, but as you will know, and as one of our colleagues has mentioned, many people actually go through quite a prolonged journey to get to that, and it might be months or years of being underground or undocumented in the UK, or on a student or a work or a marriage visa, and it may be months or years before the person actually claims asylum. many of our clients are telling us they're afraid to claim asylum, or they simply didn't know what to do, or they were advised not to. After claiming asylum, the person goes to a screening interview when it will be decided whether they'll be detained, waiting for their full interview, or whether they'll be in the community waiting for their full interview. So the first one is the screening interview. That's a shorter interview with a Home Office caseworker, and that's usually on claiming asylum, and then a decision about detention, and then the full interview usually some weeks later. Most people at this stage don't have a legal representative because of limited legal aid funding, and that means that they would receive their decision on whether they got refugee status or whether they were refused with the risk of being returned home without having had access to a legal representative, and therefore without having had access to medical evidence, which of course is commissioned and put into context of a legal case managed by a legal representative. So as I said, Ali actually claimed asylum without much delay, but we find that even in that situation, there could be lots of barriers to actually describing what's happened. So I'm just going to run through some of the common problems that people tell us that they've faced in these two interviews. So the first one is having been told what to say by an agent or trafficker. So, for example, one young man I saw recently had been trafficked across Europe by an agent who had his documents all the way through and told him what to say at each point, and he didn't speak the language in most of the places that they travelled through over land. And he found himself in the UK not really knowing exactly how he'd got there because it was all managed by somebody else that was paid to do that. And the agent had actually repeatedly threatened him during the journey against disclosing the agent's details when he arrived in the UK or saying too much. So he was very frightened, but also he didn't really know what had happened. And that causes lots of problems. So his claim was actually refused because he hadn't been able to disclose enough of his story. And we see in the refusal letter, you failed to provide any explanation. And because it's all about credibility, they would conclude this damages the credibility of your claim. Even when people very much know what's happened, we find that shame or fear can really inhibit disclosure. As I mentioned, I think that over 50% of the people I see have disclosed sexual violence, but of course late disclosure is normal here. So we don't expect clinically that people will disclose these kind of private experiences to the first person that asks. But the asylum system doesn't really accommodate late disclosure, and we devote some attention in writing our medical evidence to explaining why a person may have made a fuller disclosure in a private situation with the same gender doctor and interpreter in a safe building. All of that has to be explained. Otherwise, people can be seen to have embellished their claim for making a later disclosure. People also talk a lot about fear of authorities and processes, and of course, the reason I discussed briefly what it means to have been tortured is kind of to show the kinds of experiences people have had at the hands of their home country authorities, and of course then we can't expect that people will feel trust in the authorities in the next country that they come to, if that's here. People may also be very worried about family at home. So, for example, another client I saw recently had a father who was politically active in the home country, and he didn't want to disclose details of the father's activities, and therefore his claim was refused. And his refusal letter says it's considered that your evidence is contradictory and vague, given that you don't know what happened between your father and his political party. This inconsistency damages your claim. It's not accepted you're in danger. Fourth, lots of people, of course, are exhausted in a screening interview. It might be done on arrival. They might have just come from a plane or a lorry, and, you know, like any of us, can't perform well in an interview in that situation. People are disclosing traumatic experiences. They might experience flashbacks or vivid recalling of what's happened. I'm sure the psychologists in the room would be able to tell us more about that. And of course, stress and anxiety and trauma all have effects on memory. And there's increasing, really interesting research about what happens when we try to repeat the same history twice. And actually, none of us are particularly good at that. If I ask you to repeat twice exactly the details of your holiday, some of the dates and details will be changed. If you're asked to repeat a traumatic experience, it will be even worse. I think there's perhaps a laid belief or a general belief that very frightening events will be remembered in vivid detail, and we have had decision makers say, I would expect a person to remember when this happened as it's so significant, but actually we know that memory is not like that, and those things can actually be lost. But these, of course, cause lots of problems to people who are then perceived to lack credibility. And if any of these things cause people not to claim asylum on arrival, as Ali did, then their credibility is damaged even further. And so if actually the claim is delayed, then we see, I'll put a couple more quotes from refusal letters. You failed to make a human rights claim before being arrested. That basically means before being arrested for not having the right visa. Your claim relies wholly on matters arising after your arrest. That automatically damages your credibility. And this is a line from British policy on this. If you were considered that if you were in need of international protection, as you claim, you would have sought assistance of the British authorities at the earliest opportunity. So this is sort of enshrined in policy, and these kinds of things are repeated in lots of refusal letters that I've seen. So just returning to this and the case I want to follow through, so Ali actually did avoid some of those issues. He found a legal representative quite early on. He got a medical legal report that fitted in before his decision. He was seen at Freedom from Torture. I think I have here some of the findings from his report. So the Freedom from Torture doctor documented scars that he had, commented on photographs of his fresh injuries, commented on his post-traumatic stress disorder and mild clinical depression. And the doctor explained how all of these were directly evidence of torture. So the doctor explained how the scars appeared to be consistent with the history of violence, how the mental health looked like what we would expect if someone had experienced that kind of trauma, and the photographs, of course. So that was all went in the report, which went into the case. So what happened next? Unfortunately, the Home Office rejected the asylum claim and the medical report. I'm going to go through the reasons why it was rejected. As I said, this is one of 50 cases, so this is very much a sort of typical case. So the Home Office rejected our doctor's opinion on the physical findings. I'll quote directly from the rejection letter. The level of psychological damage is remarkably low, considering the sustained level of mistreatment you claim to have endured. This is the Home Office caseworker. That's their clinical opinion on what they would expect to happen. They're not a trained clinician, but they had overruled our doctor on that. Also on the physical findings, it's not accepted that injuries of 3 weeks, as suggested, would completely disappear in such a short time frame. This is all despite the doctor's opinion that, in fact, that could have happened medically. The injuries were not bad enough. It's also noted that you don't appear to have any further physical injuries, that you had no broken bones is considered so highly fortunate as to defy objective belief. And they thought that our doctor should have had a higher suspicion of fraud. So they said it was disappointing that the expert did not consider whether the injuries could have been inflicted by someone on your behalf in an attempt to evidence a false asylum claim. So just to be clear, that really means that they're suggesting that the person paid someone to have the scars made. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just to clarify, is the refusal based on the medical legal evidence, or do they actually get to see Ali?
And
Yes,
examine.
so they've seen him twice. So they've seen him in his screening interview and his first
No, I
claim.
mean from a medical point.
They couldn't do a physical examination no, because they're not clinically trained. So the minimum training that a caseworker needs to have is more like weeks of training and education, school level education, rather than.
So they're just judging what's in the medical report.
Yeah. So
how it's been phrased.
So exactly. So the purpose of the medical report is to assist the decision maker. It's independent medical evidence that should assist the decision maker in deciding these medical points. So I think what you're getting at is the same as what I'm getting at, which is that this is a misuse of medical evidence actually to make their own clinical judgments.
Even though they're not clinicians, really.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we're not telling them. Of course, we're not saying the answer because they are the decision maker, and it's not up to the doctor whether or not the person has asylum. The doctor can only put forward the medical point of view on the causes of the injuries, and so of course the asylum claim may be rejected for other reasons. In cases, it may be decided it's safe for the person to go home for other reasons. But I think that if the clinical evidence is being rejected for clinical reasons from somebody who's not clinically trained, then we have a really serious problem with how our information is being dealt with.
Have you actually ever really come across a fraud?
Rachel, can you repeat the question? Is that okay?
Yeah, so the question was, do you come across a fraud? Which is a really good question, actually. And so our referrals process is very difficult and competitive to get through. So to actually, at the point of being a referral to Freedom from Torture, you have to have been accepted by a highly competitive legal representative who's prepared to look for legal aid to take on your case, who thinks a medical report will help your case. And then you have to be discussed in a panel by our doctors and lawyers about whether we think we can add anything to your case. So one of the things we're looking for is there something we can document, and will it make a difference? Is it important this person has medical evidence? So by the time I am seeing the person, it's very unlikely that someone will have been able to get through that far. So I don't think I would be able to say what the position is in general, but I would say that my experience is that we're seeing very genuine cases because it would be so difficult to get through all of that. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question, or would you rather at the end?
No, it's fine.
How do you know how many sort of caseworkers there are in the Home Office?
Not off the top of my
are we
head,
talking
no.
about 10 people or 100?
Oh no, thousands, yeah.
So what,
Yeah.
And they have minimal training.
I was going to say, what sort of training, and is there a role for some, organisation like yourself to go in and offer training?
Thank you. Yeah. So, the question was about Home Office caseworkers and what training they have, and definitely, and I'll come to saying a bit more about it. But one of the proposals out of this research is that more training on how to manage survivors of severe violence or torture is put forward, and we wanted to feed into those recommendations. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So yeah, I think you get the idea now. But just to finish with these, what else did I have? The caseworker also thought the client wasn't forthcoming enough. So similar to what I touched on earlier, you were vague and evasive in your asylum interview. It appears you were happy to answer questions to which you'd rehearsed an answer. But when asked for further details, you could not remember. In the absence of medical evidence to confirm you're prone to memory difficulties, this is considered to damage your overall credibility. So again, I think there's quite a high expectation that people will be able to give a very clear and articulate initial disclosure of traumatic experiences. So in Ali's case, unfortunately, his claim was rejected, and if he's not willing or able to return home, he now faces various prospects, a very complicated appeals procedure, for which definitely he will need legal representation, legal aid, or prospect of detention and removal if he can't organise a legal case in time. in Ali's case, actually, he did appeal, and because freedom from torture, we were able to follow his case. We were able to respond to some of those erroneous clinical claims, as I described. And in particular, we were able to point out where medical opinion had been substituted for our medical opinion. And actually, then you go to a tribunal where there's a judge, and the judge looks at the medical evidence again and took a different view. So this is much nicer. So the immigration judge thought that our report was thorough and cogent, compliant with the international standard for how to report medical evidence of torture. This idea of self-infliction by proxy, which is the idea that you could pay somebody to give you scars, it was speculation only, of course. And that the Home Office hadn't supported their conclusion with any of their own medical evidence. So overall, actually the judge accepted the conclusion of our doctor that the presentation was directly evidence of the ill treatment and torture. So in the end, he did actually get his asylum, but he had to go through all of that beforehand. As I mentioned in this report, which there's copies of at the back, we've got 50 cases like Ali's, really 50 like this, in which the medical evidence was similarly not properly used. And actually, of those that appealed, over 3/4 were granted asylum by a judge. But again, what happened to those who couldn't appeal, we don't know. And so I think really this shows that even people who have robust medical evidence in their case are actually perhaps being wrongly rejected in cases where a judge would have granted asylum. A few other briefly key findings from the report.
Rachel, can I just ask a quick question from
sure.
online?
Yeah.
It's a question around whether the Home Office has any independent clinicians that it uses.
Not for medical legal reports, no. No. Actually, all medical legal reports doctors should be independent because the primary duty is to the court. So any doctor who's commissioned to provide medical evidence would have to give their objective medical opinion. And so although we may well feel very strongly about this, as a doctor, of course, you're writing objectively, these are the possible causes of this mark or scar. So there is plenty of access to independent reports, but the Home Office don't commission them directly. That's through a representative and then legal aid. Does that make sense?
They have one doctor that they use as a medical advisor, but not in
Thank
this
you, that's helpful.
area, but they have one doctor.
Okay.
Very difficult to speak to.
I can imagine,
Yeah.
like everyone in the Home Office.
Is it becoming more, bear in mind this is a political issue, immigration, a big political issue at the moment, is it becoming more and more difficult progressively over time to claim asylum and to actually get through the whole process? I mean, what I'm saying, is it becoming more unfair, or what's, have you any ideas?
I don't know overall. I guess I've been with medical justice for about 10 years, and so I could say in that time that I've seen some things changing in waves, for example. So my perception is that perhaps a few years ago there was a move towards people who were very vulnerable not being put in immigration detention, or a move away from detaining those people, and I see that slipping back now, and I think we're seeing more highly vulnerable people detained with their claims rejected now. And I think that perhaps other people here could answer that as well, but I think there is a mood that actually things are getting worse and more harsh. And I think as a result, we're also seeing perhaps more activism on this issue at the moment as well. It's actually also an interesting time to be involved. I don't know if it's a very interesting question, actually, if anyone else wants to comment on it. The question was whether things are getting worse in this respect or changing.
My experience is there's less services to refer patients to, so for those that are more vulnerable, then there's, for example, community mental health. They don't accept them. Referrals to freedom from torture, there's less resources. For legal advice, there are less organisations that are able to provide that. So it just is getting harder and harder to advocate for this kind of.
reason I asked the question, because I think politically there is a move to let fewer and fewer people into the country, not just immigrants with torture, but, you know, I've got overseas friends who can't get in as tourists, for example.
Right.
And I'm thinking that because of Brexit and all this business, it's becoming more and more difficult in all areas if you haven't got a British passport. And it reflects very much, I think, in your particular area.
Very interesting. Yeah, it certainly is political, and I imagine these things can't be fully separated from the political context. So yeah, interesting time.
What's the position, or when did it? I can't remember now, but there was a change in legal aid, which had a massive impact. Is that what's the current? You know, is there any legal aid at all?
Yes, there was a. Yeah, there've been a couple of significant changes, but there is now legal aid available for medical legal reports and for legal aid for asylum cases in cases where the person is vulnerable. So people who might be a survivor of torture should now be able to get legal aid.
Okay, so the current legal situation is legal aid for.
I'm probably not the right person to ask, but my understanding is that there's legal aid for people who are vulnerable or survivors of torture. So many of our medical legal reports are legal aid funded.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
But there's less and less chambers who are actually applying for their lawyers to have that status. As in, you know, that they'll take legal aid cases.
This is always on my mind. It makes me very angry when I'm doing outreach. How can you stop or report law sharks? People who charge £50 for 10 minutes, and perhaps that person has a right to get free legal advice. I just get so angry about it.
So the question's about poor legal representation or law sharks.
Aren't they? They're wicked. Yeah.
Certainly a potential cause of exploitation.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Home Office agents are interested in improving their ability to assess asylum seekers, or are they just happy with having exactly this kind of procedure? Is it a lack of will, or a lack of training, or is it a lack of funding? What exactly is the problem?
Well, that's a good question. So the question was about whether Home Office workers are interested in improving this system. I guess now I've said several problems with it. And of course, my criticism is not aimed at individual Home Office caseworkers who I can only imagine are doing a phenomenally difficult job. They must be simply overwhelmed. And, you know, I can say that I hear these stories in a very supported and very well prepared way, and it's still very hard. So I'm not going to say it's easy to be a Home Office caseworker. And of course, there's a huge individual will to improve things. But I think the asylum system is a system and a culture and has to be looked at that way. And, you know, the phrase culture of disbelief has been around for years to describe exactly this kind of thing, where we see systematic disbelief, a system that's skewed towards rejecting cases. And I'm sure about that because as a doctor, if I believe there may be a risk of something terrible happening, then of course my priority is to make sure that I've got that covered and that I've excluded it before we move on. So if I thought somebody might be having a heart attack, my priority would be to make sure that wasn't happening before I said you're making it up. And I can see that there's a system here where we have people who might be at risk of their lives, and there's not a system to make absolutely sure that that isn't the case before we move on. And in fact, it's a system that's supposed to find a way of rejecting the claim. So
it really sounds like guilty until you can prove your innocence, which is the wrong way around, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think that's what needs to be worked on. And of course, one of the potential ways forward is to think about how to use evidence for asylum claims. So I'm only speaking medically, but I'm sure there are colleagues and expertise about country evidence. And in terms of medical evidence, definitely people can be trained to use and understand medical evidence. But this needs, a lot of political will and organisational changes and cultural changes. And so I guess one of the reasons I'm so happy to speak to you all today is that I think that the more people that are aware of this and aware of the problems, the more that we can keep this on the agenda. I think I'm coming to an end actually, but briefly the other key findings of the report I think that we've touched on really. We feel that the Home Office are using an incorrect standard of proof. I think that's what I'm saying here, replacing expert opinion, questioning expertise wrongly, and in generally a wrong approach to medical evidence and expertise. So these were the recommendations. So first of all, immediate measures to improve decision making. An independent public audit hasn't been carried out yet. I'm going to switch to a video now for a little pause from me talking, which is a video made by our service user network, Survivors Speak Out. So these are former service users and have their own network campaigning for rights for survivors of torture, and they're discussing here the handling of their medical evidence and how they felt about that.
There's no sound at the beginning.
There's no sound at all, so don't worry.
How much freedom from torture medical legal report has helped you securing protection?
I had a very good report from the doctor that has clearly supported what I have said to the screening or the interview unit. They have experts who will talk to you and see what actually you said is true or not. So it has played a very good role in securing protection in this country.
When the medical report was refused by the Home Office, you feel very bad. And in the refusal letter, you feel like they didn't even go through the report to read it, to understand it. They just refused like that. So it was a very, very bad experience really with the Home Office and for them not trusting the medical reports. You can imagine the kind of embarrassment.
So this 3-year period was like I have been waiting for tens of years. So during this period, I have been waiting, leaving a family home I have not seen for many years. And I was in that suspense of what the results will be, whether they're going to say yes or no. So all this while, I couldn't do anything. I have no right to work. I have no right to do anything because, once you are in the asylum process, you have no right, no right, no right, no right.
Even today, I still ask myself, why do the Home Office don't accept the legal reports? You are going back to square one. You're repeating yourself. You cannot do anything for yourself. These are the things which are running into your head because you don't know. By that time, you're nothing.
Could you talk a little bit about the process of the medical legal report, how that process affects you?
It's not an easy process because you feel like kind of scared, like that. This is it. If I get it wrong, they may not believe me. Every time you have to talk about it, it's like you're going back and you feel very bad, you feel very emotional. And also you start thinking at that right moment that if they don't accept the medical report, what am I going to do? Maybe they will send me back to the same people who tortured me before.
It took 8 years for me to hear an answer. And that's a very, very, very difficult time for someone who is a victim of torture, who is going through trauma. The time length is too big. And then I feel emotionally and mentally treated and tortured during that time.
question from online, Rachel, and that is, how do you avoid re-traumatizing people when you're revisiting these things?
Thanks, that's a very good question, thank you. So how do we avoid re-traumatising people revisiting these things? So I think re-traumatisation is when somebody has to recount their story in a way, or it might happen if somebody has to recount their story in a way that's frightening or threatening, or if they aren't able to have control of the process. And so that's a huge risk actually in any of these interviews. It's a risk in people's immigration screening interviews, and it's a risk for us as doctors. The things I think we can do to reduce the risk, perhaps firstly to try to give the person control of the process, which they've obviously not been able to have in a violent, in an experience of violence. So to make sure the person knows they can stop and start when they want to, they can take a break, they don't have to say more than they're comfortable with saying. You know, the idea that the person can actually consent and participate in that process of writing down and documenting their history, to see it as something that is for them rather than for us. But of course, I don't think there's a way to avoid the risk completely, because the fact is that people are having to actually prove what's happened to them. And as you can see, it's a very high bar actually. So I don't think that risk can be avoided completely. People are basically being forced to disclose their stories in order to prove what's happened, and that definitely is a risk of re-traumatisation. So, of course, we have training on how to manage that, what to do if people become distressed, how to pace the appointments, introduce difficult topics, and so on. And there's therapy available within Freedom from Torture too, but I think it is a real risk. So, yeah, good question.
Do your clients actually go in with somebody beside them, do they? Or are they asked to go into these interviews alone?
They can take somebody with them, but that person wouldn't be able to speak, and they can't take a legal representative. I think you mean to the Home Office interviews.
Yes.
Can they take somebody with them? So that there's no legal aid funding at all for the legal representative to go with them into the interview, so they can't take a lawyer. They could take somebody else, but my understanding is that person wouldn't be able to speak.
But they can take notes?
I believe so, yeah.
I also imagine they're quite isolated. How would they find somebody to go with them just to have a bit of moral support? How do they find these people?
I think the exception is if somebody is lacking mental capacity to instruct or to take an interview, then their lawyer could, of course, apply for special permission to represent them in that interview. But that's actually very rare. Very rarely see that.
Do they get enough advice when they make the first application? Are they completely on their own? Do they have any? I don't know who deals with this, but does the system actually sit down with them and say these are your rights and what you should do? Or,
No, not really. No, there is obviously a lot of information available if people know where to look. But actually,
that's one of the problems.
Yeah, I think quite often people are, you know, they may well not speak English and they may well not understand the system at all. And people tell us that, you know, they really didn't know what was going to happen next, or they had difficulty understanding the interpreter. And, you know, I think it's far from a situation where people really understand the importance, for example, of say it's very important to say the right dates for what's happened to you. And I don't think people know what will happen if they just guess, you know, or to give a rough estimate without saying that's an estimate. I don't think those things are clear to people at all. How would you expect that? You know, I didn't know that until I was very involved in this work. So, yeah.
So there's an organisation that's meant to support people seeking asylum called Migrant Help UK, but it's very much dependent on that individual knowing that they can contact them, and then it's a phone call. So you don't have to speak English, but you need to know you can contact them and this is the phone number, and you're waiting then to speak to someone, and you can be waiting for quite a long time. Some of the people seeking asylum come into something called initial accommodation in the UK, and migrant help are based in those accommodations. But that's only a small percentage of people who are seeking asylum. So there's many others that miss out on that process of having someone to support them. So it's not straightforward.
No.
And then
no.
if they're not literate, then, you know, and they are there on their own, in the UK on their own, and they haven't got someone with them, you know, it's very difficult. There's many that get missed.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it would also be interesting to know how it varies through the UK, because of course in central London here we've got access to lots more resources than, you know, perhaps you might find. But still, you know, as my colleague said, it very much depends on knowing what's needed. You know, and what I really feel is the sort of disappointment of the idea that you've arrived in a safe country and you'll tell your story and it'll be okay. And of course, that's just not what happens usually. So, okay. So I think that's basically what I wanted to say. But I would like to take the chance to plug our current campaign. So there's lots of interesting things actually on our website, including the Freedom from the Proving Torture report that I've discussed if you're interested in more. But our campaigns and communications team have asked me to particularly mention this, which is our current campaign. So I mentioned earlier the government are currently reviewing the definition of torture used in immigration detention centres. What this all boils down to really, I would say, is disbelief, because the reason that anyone is in immigration detention after they've claimed asylum is because their claim hasn't been believed, or because, you know, or if their claim is in process because of the idea that it might not be believed, because otherwise, of course, people would just be allowed to stay where they were in the UK. So it very much relates to what I've been discussing. I mentioned that redefinition of torture may exclude some vulnerable people, but also this is a way of looking at who should and shouldn't be detained in immigration detention. So there's more information at the back. On our website there's also a link to a letter to Amber Rudd, which is asking the government to do a lot more consultation before pushing through a definition. I don't know if anybody, I've just heard about Question Time last week, on which Brendan Lewis said that there were no refugees or asylum seekers in immigration detention in the UK. So anyway, that was interesting. And
Did you quote any dates with that?
No, currently. He said there were currently no.
How many people are there?
30,000 a year.
Do you feel that Amber Rudd is on your side, or she's another brick wall to knock down? What are your thoughts?
No.
You're allowed to say no comment.
I think that this current plan, to specifically on this, I think they want to rush through a definition of torture without a proper consultation. And my organisation have been very clear from the start that we have expert knowledge on this, that they should be consulting on. And so I think this absolutely needs to be halted while there is a proper consultation. Thank you.
Sorry, in a very practical way, who else is doing medical legal reports apart from yourselves? Tavistock? I've just seen recently from Tavistock.
Yeah, so Helen Bamber Foundation is very active. Also, they are also seeing many survivors of trafficking, and medical justice are seeing people in immigration detention and doing medical reports there in the detention centres.
That's in detention.
And then there are many individual doctors who are commissioned directly by legal representatives who have varying degrees of expertise and experience.
But if in terms of a sort of an official referral like from the NHS, you go HBF or yourselves?
No, that's a really good question actually. So in terms of a referral for medical evidence, so the first thing is to have a legal representative. So actually the first thing that somebody needs before they get medical evidence is a legal representative who will commission the report themselves.
Exactly, we can't
so
refer directly.
We wouldn't take. No, and that's simply because the legal representative would have to contextualise the report and put it as part of the case, because of course, you know, as I said, the doctor's not making the decision about asylum, they're just putting together the medical evidence, and there may be many other aspects to the case.
So, probably not quite the right question, but to everybody here, is there a recommended, because as we've already discussed, there's a lot of lawyers out there that are perhaps not working in the clients or not working in the asylum seeker's best interest for whatever reason. But there are many legal firms, well, not many, but who knows the legal firms that are reputable that are working in conjunction with a Italian medical
In
foundation?
Southwark, there's Southwark Law Centre, just Google Southwark Law Centre.
Yeah, apart from Southwark Law Centre?
I don't know.
Sorry, I was just going to say that Helen Bamber Foundation have a list of the ones that they recommend.
Yeah.
Which include the Lambeth Law Centre, Wilson's, which is
It's on the Helen Bamber Foundation.
I'm not sure if it's on their website or if you have to contact them and get it. I've seen it.
Yeah, okay,
given it to
so
a
that's where
client,
to get it.
you could
But
get
they're
a
holding
good
a list
and it's a number of different legal practices in London across.
That's helpful, thank you. I think the other way of doing it would be to approach one of these organisations for anybody in detention, medical justice, or Helen Bamber or Freedom from Torture for people that have therapeutic needs or are unwell, and then for advice as Refugee Council as well. So I think to go through one of those routes would be
just checking.
Thank you.
Just one, sorry,
Go for it.
one bit hypothetical. Suppose an asylum seeker came to me and said, what do I do now? What advice would I give them?
Yeah.
Because there must be a lot of people in this position.
That's difficult for me as not a lawyer, but I would say the first thing is to get legal advice on your position, and I think, given what I do know about the impact of delayed claims on the assessment of credibility, I think that if people can be helped to make these disclosures at the first opportunity to the right person, then that's fantastic. So really, but for that, of course, you need a good legal representative. So I think you'd be thinking about approaching one of these good organisations for support. The other thing, of course, is anybody who is a survivor of violence should be assessed clinically. And so people often struggle, for example, with having a GP, and there's a lot of help now available from Doctors of the World, and in fact this network has been campaigning on access to healthcare, so as I'm sure you know, so the other thing would be to get them linked in with a good GP to help get them started.
But is legal advice is the real kingpin, the real thing to do?
I think legal advice is essential, yeah.
I mean, I do live in the area where there's a lot of immigrants, and you never know. Someone may ask them, they haven't yet, but you never know.
Got a couple of questions online, if that's all right. One's following up the question we talked about earlier about re-traumatizing. And of course, well, for certain examinations, they can be really quite invasive. So particularly examinations looking for sexual violence.
Yeah.
How do you find that balance between kind of, you know, the risk of re-traumatizing and those kind of very invasive procedures and gaining evidence, and how do you approach that?
I think similarly, I guess, to what I touched on earlier, the most important thing is that the person doesn't have to undergo that examination if they don't want to, and of course there should be absolutely no forced examination of anybody, and it should be absolutely consensual. So in order to do an intimate examination of someone who's a survivor of violence, the doctor should have consent with an interpreter, and you know, I would usually even perhaps raise the issue in the first meeting and then actually examine them in the second, and then, you know, you get a bit of time for the person to actually consider if they can face it or not and come back and do it. And, you know, if somebody can't be examined, then that in itself is not, doesn't go against their claim, and I would be very confident to be able to explain that actually, you know, it may well be that somebody is traumatised, that may well be why they don't want to be examined, and so in a way we would still be able to discuss it and work with it, but it's a difficult one.
the second question online is: does freedom from torture have any reaction or role to the detention conditions here in the UK, including alleged deliberate detention of survivors of torture?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, absolutely. So, freedom from torture's experience and my experience is that many survivors of torture are being put through immigration detention in the UK for prolonged periods. In immigration detention, there is a healthcare centre in all of the detention centres, and there is an immigration rule that if somebody is suspected by a member of staff to be a survivor of torture, they must have a long appointment in the healthcare centre, and their risk or evidence of being a survivor of torture or of violence should be documented by the doctor and reported to the Home Office. And of course that acknowledges that these people shouldn't be detained. Over recent years there's been a change in the threshold for detaining people in such cases, so it's now accepted in exceptional cases that people would be detained, but what's an exceptional case is a balance for a Home Office decision maker to decide. Are they very worried that this person will run away and never be seen again if they're not in detention, or are they very worried about the person's vulnerability? And those things are balanced. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is the balance in favour of detaining people, even though their own immigration centre doctor has documented that they're concerned that the person is a survivor of torture. And I've seen very clear reports over and over again that say this person has this evidence that they're a survivor of torture. Clinicians going out on a limb to give their own opinion that the person is a survivor of torture, and the person's still in immigration detention. So this is absolutely happening. And I think that the person asking the question, but also anyone else that wants to get involved, I would really ask to have a look at this current campaign on detention, because this is all about detention of vulnerable people, and particularly how policy is worded to facilitate or allow detention in some circumstances, especially of survivors of torture.
Is freedom from torture like campaign any other issues like something like extraordinary conditions or what government started to stop torture?
The question was about freedom from torture's other campaigns, and if freedom from torture are lobbying the government on other issues like extraordinary rendition or sorry, what was the other one?
Or just simply so government which torture is
so we've produced some evidence based on instances of torture in several countries. So recently we've produced a report of many cases of people, Sri Lankan Tamil people who've been tortured, cases from DRC, and a recent report on Iran. So we're compiling data from what we're hearing from people from those countries. Of course that can be used to lobby our government about evidence of what people are saying here, but it can also be used to lobby on an international level as well. So we're putting that information together as we get it. And as these different issues come up, then we have a campaigns team, a small campaigns team that are continually working on these issues, all from a view of representing survivors of torture and thinking about what we can do with the information that we're getting.
In terms of, and I'm not quite sure what I'm asking, but it's to do with when the leave to remain is up and then people are applying for indefinite leave to remain. And in terms of putting medical leave reports in, I don't know how much of that is coming. So somebody may have had leave to remain for a limited period in the country, but then, for instance, somebody from the Middle East, and then to go back. So it's and that space between leave to remain and the indefinite leave to remain.
I think they're slightly different categories because the medical evidence we're thinking about is asylum claims, and then when somebody is granted asylum, they then have leave to remain. So I don't think the medical evidence comes in again later.
but a report that would support indefinite leave to remain. They may have been here for.
I think once you have limited leave to remain, you get it for a period of 5 years.
Yeah, okay, but then that's
once you have it,
yeah.
Once if you haven't broken the conditions of your leave, you after 5 years you get indefinite leave to remain. You don't need to prove anything at that point.
I think it's almost a given.
Yeah, I mean,
if you've done nothing wrong.
Unless there's a criminal issue, say. Or,
yeah, if you've done nothing wrong.
So if you have like if you commit a crime, then you might not get it. Then you might be short.
But if there's been no legal issues, what you're saying is that it's automatic.
You apply for it, and you prove that you haven't broken the conditions of the legal. You can support yourself and your family, say, and that's it. And then you get it.
But if you can't support yourself because you've been mentally unwell, I don't know how long.
There are extreme circumstances. You would consider it, but it wouldn't be a typical case. You would consider your case individually at that point.
Petra, how many people do you see a month, say? And if you see, do you see them as a medical doctor, or can you also see them as a psychological case, or do you have different teams of people with the one client that goes through your system?
Thank you. Yeah. So, the question is how many people we would see a month, or what the frequency is, and whether we could see them as just medical or psychological as well. So the process of medical legal reports, I'm glad you asked, because I can say how time consuming it is. So we offer people three appointments of 2 hours each. And then our reports now are pages long. So at least a day's work, I would say, for a report. So the reason I'm pleased to say actually is because, as you can hear, I really want our evidence to be taken as seriously as it should be, and we're putting lots of work into extremely carefully documenting the evidence that we see, and writing it up very carefully and very objectively and very clearly. And so I like people to know actually how long we do spend on it. In my other life, I'm a GP, so I really feel that is a lot of time. And then in answer to the question about medical and psychological, so all of our medical legal doctors are trained to document psychological consequences of torture as well. They're all capable of making diagnoses that are common in survivors of torture, like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. We do have psychiatrists that we can refer to for more unusual presentations.
And how many do you say approximately?
From that's basically most of our doctors are volunteers and see one person a week, 3 weeks in a row, and a fourth day writing up. So that'd be about one person a month per doctor. My position is slightly different because I'm employed. I'm doing some training and reviewing as well, so I do some other activities. But basically, that sort of one or two. Yeah.
You've got other services as well, haven't you? So you've got the garden, because patients of ours got to be referred to your service.
Yeah. So
the garden stuff. You've got the family therapy workers, and some of our families come.
So what I'm talking about there in terms of huge amounts of time is medical legal reports. So that's actually just a very small part of freedom from torture, which I'm talking about today because I'm interested to discuss about medical evidence. But freedom from torture is a much bigger organisation with therapies departments. So we have psychologists, counselling, therapies, many groups, including doing gardening, cooking, sports, football. Something I really wanted to mention was the writing group called Right to Life, and there's some of these in a pile at the back. These are actually poetry written by survivors of torture who've been in immigration detention. I think it's really powerful because, I was saying earlier, because I think it's so humanising poetry that this may be something that could get the message across as well. So there's a few copies at the back there. So as a big organisation, we're doing lots of other things, but those big chunks of time is medical evidence.
Can I just ask that's interesting because you mentioned that you'll see them 3 times for 2 hours each and then write the report, and I know that that's very different from lots of independent practitioners.
Is
who
it?
See people once for 2 hours and then write a report.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder, comment on that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is a lot of time, and I also do reports for medical justice, and there we're going into immigration detention, and so I'm probably only seeing a person once, although I might speak to them on the phone. So though I would try and stay, do as thorough an assessment as I could in that day, it's a much more confined obviously, situation. So that comes with its own challenges. I think over 3 sessions you really get a picture of somebody and you start to get to know each other, and it's very common that you get more disclosures in the 3rd appointment because they feel they know you and they've spent some time with you. So that obviously has a huge impact on what we can say. But on the other hand, an experienced doctor could take one look at a scar that's obviously a burn mark due to a certain type of implement and be able to say very quickly what that was. So I don't think this huge amount of time is necessary. But on the other hand, as you see, our reports are being rejected and criticised for very small deviations from perfect. So the standard is actually really escalating for what is expected of a medical report. I don't know how independent doctors I don't know how they monitor their sort of success rates or acceptance rates, or what difficulties they would face having a more pressured time. Be interesting to know.
So once the medical reports has been rejected by all of this, because the next step will be detention and then deportation. So as we know, torture, prohibition of torture is in most of the human rights conventions. So you also use that as another link, in order to stop the deportation procedure, and that person could be granted another form of protection, so humanitarian protection. I don't know if you also do that once the asylum claim is rejected.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are other legal avenues than asylum, but I guess if somebody has been tortured in the country that they're proposed to return to, then there needs to be a good reason to think that they're safe now, for that to be permitted under international law. So it's illegal. We're signatories. This country's signatories to the UN Convention Against Torture. It's illegal to return people to a situation where they may be tortured. There are cases that we see in which perhaps there's been regime change in the home country and the person's considered to not be at risk anymore, and that's one way that sometimes that, but of course that's completely outside of my medical expertise. I wouldn't be able to advise on whether or what was happening there. All we can say medically is that it looks like torture has happened, but of course, I think anybody would agree that the past is usually a very good guide to the future. And so if we know it's happened, then of course the person is at risk. But what happens next is a legal question. Does that make sense?
I think we're coming up to 8 o'clock. So are there any last questions at all?
Thank you very much for the really good discussion. Really lovely to meet you all.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel, what we could do, if it's okay,
Thank you.
Maybe let me just stop the streaming, but we can maybe share some of the electronic resources with the association. We can maybe put it on our website, and then signpost our members towards that.
That sounds great.
Actually, this as well,
Yeah.
so that we can, even people who weren't here can get
Yeah.
our report about how great it's gone.
Perfect. Yeah, we'd love them to sign. We'd love them to sign it, or even go and speak to their MP.